Two men are sitting in federal custody in West Michigan right now, thousands of miles from home, after being extradited from Colombia to face charges that could put them in a U.S. prison for years. They didn't get arrested on American soil. They didn't get picked up crossing a border. They were identified, detained, and handed over by another country's government through a process most people have heard of but very few actually understand. According to WZZM13, the two men, both Colombian nationals, have been transferred into United States custody and now face federal drug trafficking charges in Michigan's federal court system. So how does that actually work? How does someone living in Colombia end up standing in front of a judge in Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo? That's what we're walking through today, not with speculation, but with what's actually known and the legal mechanics that make a case like this possible in the first place. Before we go further, one thing needs to be said clearly. These two men are charged. They are not convicted. Under the law, and under the presumption that runs through the entire American justice system, they are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Everything from here on, the charges, the process, the questions still open, has to be read with that in mind. Here's where this is going. First, what's actually been reported so far. No more, no less. Then we'll break down what extradition actually is, because it's one of the most misunderstood parts of international law and rarely as simple as television makes it look. From there, what a federal drug trafficking charge actually means, why it's handled differently than a state-level charge, and what these two men are now facing procedurally in the coming weeks and months. And we'll end with what's still unknown, because in a case this fresh, there's more we don't know than we do, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Let's start with the facts as reported. According to WZZM13, two Colombian nationals have been extradited to West Michigan, where they now face federal drug trafficking charges. The men were transferred into U.S. custody as part of a criminal case now proceeding through Michigan's federal court system. That's the reporting. That's what we can say with confidence. Anything beyond that, the specific quantities involved, the route the alleged trafficking took, the names of any additional people connected to the case hasn't been detailed in the public reporting available right now, and we're not going to invent it to fill time. If the facts are thin, the honest move is to say so, not dress up a case with details that sound compelling but aren't verified. I'll say this plainly. I went looking for more before sitting down to record this, the way I do with every case we cover. Sometimes that digging turns up court dockets, indictment language, prior arrest records from other jurisdictions. Sometimes it doesn't. In this case, what's publicly confirmed right now is the extradition itself and the nature of the charges, federal drug trafficking. That's a real, serious legal category, worth understanding even without every operational detail of this specific case. So let's get into extradition, because it's the part of this story that's actually the most interesting and the part that's least understood. Extradition is the formal legal process by which one country hands over a person to another country so that person can face criminal charges or serve a sentence. It's not a raid. It's not agents crossing a border. It's a diplomatic and judicial process that runs on treaties, courts, and often years of legal back and forth. The United States has extradition treaties with dozens of countries, and Colombia is one of them. That relationship goes back decades, and it hasn't always been simple. For a stretch of time, particularly during the height of the cartel era in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Colombia's own constitution barred the extradition of its citizens to other countries, a policy shaped in large part by the violent political pressure cartel leaders exerted specifically to avoid facing American courts. That ban was eventually lifted, and Colombia's extradition of its own nationals to the United States, particularly in drug trafficking cases, has been an active and closely watched part of the two countries' law enforcement relationship ever since. Here's the part most people don't think about when they hear the word extradition. It's slow, and it's not guaranteed. A person facing extradition from Colombia, or from most countries, has the right to challenge it through that country's own legal system before ever being handed over. That can mean months, sometimes years, of hearings, appeals, and diplomatic negotiation, all happening before the person ever sets foot on U.S. soil. Extradition doesn't happen because the United States asks nicely. It happens because a treaty obligates cooperation, because a foreign court reviews the request and the evidence behind it, and because, eventually, that legal process concludes with a transfer. By the time someone is extradited and standing in a Michigan courtroom, a foreign judiciary has already looked at the case once. That's worth sitting with for a second. Think about the position of a prosecutor building a case that depends on a foreign extradition. The case has to convince a foreign court that handing this person over is legally justified long before it ever reaches an American jury. That's a higher bar than most people realize, and it's part of why international drug trafficking cases often take years to reach the point we're seeing here. An actual transfer into U.S. custody. Now, what these men are actually charged with in terms of the legal category involved, federal drug trafficking. In the United States, drug crimes can be prosecuted at the state level or the federal level, and the difference matters enormously. State drug charges are handled under a given state's own laws, prosecuted by county or state prosecutors, and typically involve conduct that stayed within that state's borders. Federal drug trafficking charges are a different animal. They're prosecuted under federal law, primarily the Controlled Substances Act, by U.S. attorneys' offices, and they typically come into play when the conduct crosses state lines, crosses international borders, involves quantities large enough to trigger federal sentencing thresholds, or involves organized, multi-person distribution networks rather than a single small-scale transaction. A case that involves extradition from another country almost by definition falls into federal jurisdiction, because the moment the alleged conduct crosses an international border, state law simply doesn't reach it. That's a job for federal prosecutors, and it's why a case like this is proceeding through Michigan's federal court system rather than a county courthouse. Cases prosecuted out of West Michigan generally fall under the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Western District of Michigan, one of two federal judicial districts covering the state, the other being the Eastern District. That's simply how the federal court system is organized geographically. It's public structure, not a detail specific to this case, but it helps explain where a case like this physically proceeds once someone is in custody. Federal drug trafficking charges carry penalties that are, frankly, much steeper than most people expect. Depending on the quantity and type of controlled substance alleged, federal law includes mandatory minimum sentences, meaning a judge's hands can be legally tied to impose at least a certain number of years in prison upon conviction, regardless of other circumstances. For serious trafficking quantities, those mandatory minimums can run 5 years, 10 years, or in the most severe cases, life. That's part of why federal drug cases carry so much weight, and why the stakes for anyone facing them, extradited or not, are genuinely severe. Again, none of that tells us what these two specific men are alleged to have done in terms of quantity or role. It tells us the legal framework they're now inside. Here's the part that might surprise you if you've never followed a federal case from arrest to resolution. Extradition isn't the finish line. It's closer to the starting gate. Once a defendant is physically transferred into U.S. custody, the entire domestic federal criminal process begins essentially from scratch, procedurally speaking. There's an initial appearance in front of a magistrate judge where the defendant is formally notified of the charges against them. There's a detention hearing where a judge decides whether the person will be held in custody pending trial or released under conditions, and in extradition cases involving foreign nationals with limited ties to the community, prosecutors very often argue for detention, citing flight risk. There's an arraignment where the defendant enters a plea. Then comes discovery, where the defense reviews the government's evidence, followed by a period where the case either moves toward a negotiated plea agreement, which is how most federal criminal cases actually resolve, or toward trial. What's most surprising about federal drug cases in general isn't the arrest, or even the extradition. It's how long the process afterward can take. Federal criminal cases, especially ones involving multiple potential co-defendants or international elements, can stretch on for a year or more between the initial appearance and any final resolution. That's not unusual, and it's not a sign of anything going wrong. It's simply how a system built around due process, evidence review, and the right to a defense actually functions. Now, here's a take that might not sit comfortably with everyone, and I'll say it plainly rather than dance around it. The extradition process, for all its slowness and diplomatic complexity, is one of the more quietly effective tools in international law enforcement, and it also raises legitimate questions about fairness when it's applied unevenly. Extradition depends entirely on treaties and political will. A person can be extradited from a country with a strong treaty relationship with the United States far more readily than from a country without one, regardless of the strength of the evidence against them. That means geography and diplomacy end up shaping who actually faces American courts and who doesn't, in ways that have very little to do with guilt or innocence. That's not a criticism of this specific case. We don't have the facts here to say whether the process worked well or poorly in this instance, but it's a real structural tension in how international drug enforcement functions, and it's worth sitting with. So here's a genuine question, and I mean it as one. Does extradition, as a tool, do more to deliver accountability across borders, or does it mostly just relocate the same problems into a different courtroom without addressing what drives international trafficking networks in the first place? I'd actually read the answers on this one. It's not a rhetorical question dressed up to get a reaction. Let's bring it back to what we actually know about this case. Where does it stand right now? As of this reporting, both men are in federal custody in Michigan. The case is active in the federal court system, and the process described above, initial appearance, detention, determination, arraignment, and whatever comes after, is either underway or about to begin. No trial date, verdict, plea agreement, or additional details about the nature of the alleged trafficking operation have been reported publicly in the sourcing available for this video. And to repeat what needs repeating, both men are presumed innocent. A federal charge is an allegation formally brought by prosecutors. It is not a finding of guilt, and it never should be treated as one, no matter how serious the charge sounds. What's genuinely still open and unknown at this point? Quite a bit. We don't know the specific quantities or type of substance allegedly involved. We don't know whether there are additional defendants connected to the broader case who haven't been named in this reporting. We don't know whether either man intends to contest the charges at trial or negotiate a plea, a decision that typically comes much later in the process. We don't know the specific timeline of the extradition process itself, how long it took from the initial request to the actual transfer, or what legal challenges, if any, were raised in Colombia along the way. Those are the kinds of details that tend to surface as a federal case moves forward through court filings, hearings, and eventually, if it goes that far, a trial, and not before. If you want to follow this yourself rather than wait for us to cover an update, federal criminal cases like this one are part of the public record. Court filings are searchable through the Federal Judiciary's Electronic Records System, PACER, under the Western District of Michigan. The Department of Justice periodically issues press releases on significant federal prosecutions through its official website, and DOJ district offices, including the one covering West Michigan, do the same. Those primary sources are where verified updates on a case like this will actually appear first, not secondhand summaries, this video included. One honest note before we close, there's more we'd like to tell you about how this specific extradition was carried out, the diplomatic mechanics behind it, but the public reporting simply doesn't go into that level of detail yet. If more surfaces, that's a story worth revisiting. For now, what we can say is this. 2 men have been extradited from Colombia to face federal drug trafficking charges in Michigan. The case is moving through the federal court system, and under the law, they remain innocent until any court says otherwise. That's the story as it stands. Not more, not less.